Could a celebrated war hero become one of the most controversial figures in the British royal family? Behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace, where tradition meets absolute discretion, a story began to unfold that would permanently shake the carefully cultivated image of Prince Andrew. Born on February 19, 1960, the third child and second son of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, seemed destined for a life in the spotlight from the very beginning. The public knew him as a confident naval officer who served as a helicopter pilot in the Falklands War in 1982. While many royals primarily performed ceremonial duties, Prince Andrew had gained actual combat experience. He flew missions for anti-submarine warfare and the evacuation of the wounded. This biography bestowed upon him an aura of bravery that long shielded him from criticism. Upon his return, he was celebrated. In 1986, his fairy tale wedding to Sarah Ferguson took place at Westminster Abbey. Millions watched the spectacle. The marriage produced Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. Even after their divorce in 1996, the image of a modern, friendly, and close-knit couple persisted. Photographs showed Prince William skiing with his daughters at school events and family gatherings. To many, he appeared to be an approachable, dedicated father within a dynasty steeped in tradition. Between 2001 and 2011, Prince William served as special representative for international trade and investment. He traveled tirelessly around the world, cultivating relationships with British companies. The nickname A. Miles Andy circulated in the media, but it was considered a humorous reference to his hectic schedule. Officially, he served Britain's economic interests. But while the public image conveyed stability and a sense of duty, a completely different narrative was taking shape behind the scenes. One man who witnessed this hidden reality firsthand was Paul Page. Between 1998 and 2004, he worked as a royal protection officer at Buckingham Palace. For 6 years, he moved in close proximity to the royal family, monitoring security cameras, securing corridors, and standing guard outside private apartments. What Paul Page witnessed there remained hidden for a long time. It wasn't until 2022 that he went public with his account, at a time when Prince Andrew was already under immense pressure due to allegations involving Virginia Giuffre, Jeffrey Epstein, and Ghislaine Maxwell. Paul Page's statements formed a picture that differed dramatically from the Duke of York's long-held self-portrayal. The central question was suddenly no longer just what contacts Prince Andrew had cultivated, but who he truly was when the cameras weren't rolling. While Queen Elizabeth II had been considered a symbol of discipline and duty for decades, and Prince Philip was known for his direct yet loyal manner, voices from within the palace began to paint a different picture of Prince Andrew. Paul Page described a man who behaved differently behind closed doors than he did at official events. His reports cast doubt on whether the image of the dutiful prince truly reflected reality. And with each new revelation, the impression grew that two versions of the same person were at odds: the publicly celebrated figure and the privately operating power broker. Added to this was the growing shadow of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. While Prince Andrew publicly declared his contacts to be purely social, questions increasingly arose about the closeness, intensity, and duration of these relationships. Virginia Giuffre's subsequent civil lawsuit finally brought the issue to the forefront of international media coverage. When Prince Andrew gave his now infamous interview in November, it was meant to be a breakthrough. Instead, it became a turning point. His explanations failed to convince many observers. The reputation that had been built up over decades began to crumble. Shortly afterward, he withdrew from public duties. But for Paul Page, this was merely the visible tip of the iceberg. In his view, the system had functioned for a long time because loyalty and silence were commonplace. Only when external pressure became unbearable did the floodgates open. So what was real? The decorated war veteran, the devoted father, the trade envoy, or the man behind palace walls whom staff described as intimidating and disrespectful? Was the public image a carefully curated facade? And how many clues might have been visible earlier but ignored? These questions begin a story that goes far beyond personal scandals. It touches the very core of an institution built on tradition, honor, and moral authority. When a prince falls, does only one person fall, or does the entire system crumble? A nighttime alarm in the heart of Buckingham Palace was about to change everything. It was a routine surveillance check, part of the daily routine for the security team. Queen Elizabeth was not in the palace at the time. That is precisely why the sight on the surveillance monitors was so explosive. A figure was moving through the Queen's private quarters, an area that should have been empty at that hour. For Paul Page and his colleagues, this was no ordinary moment. Any unauthorized access to Queen Elizabeth II's private apartments represented a potentially serious threat. Security protocols kicked in immediately. Sergeant Paul Page and 2 other police officers hurried strategically through the corridors, ready to respond to any potential security breach. What they found, however, was not an intruder. It was Prince Andrew, Duke of York, dressed in a tracksuit, wandering through his mother's private quarters. What initially seemed like a misunderstanding, according to Paul Page, became a real eye-opener. Instead of showing understanding for the security measures, Prince Andrew reacted with sharp disapproval. For Paul Page, this was not just an unpleasant encounter. It was the first clear indication of an attitude that would later be reflected in other incidents. While Queen Elizabeth was described by Paul Page as respectful and friendly, and Prince Philip as direct but fair, Prince Andrew, according to his account, presented a different picture. For Paul Page, this event was not an isolated slip-up, but the beginning of a pattern. Public perception continued to portray him as a war veteran, the father of Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, and a representative of British trade interests. But behind the scenes, according to accounts, a pattern of behavior emerged that frustrated staff. It wasn't so much about this single incident as it was about the feeling that rules were applied more flexibly to some than to others. The nighttime scene in the corridor became symbolic for Paul Page. It represented an attitude that viewed security protocols as a bothersome formality. For a security team, however, these very rules are the foundation of their work, regardless of whether they are a staff member or a member of the royal family. At the same time, another shadow was beginning to fall over Prince Andrew. His acquaintance with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell was not yet a global sensation. But in retrospect, each episode took on new significance. If internal security structures were already perceived as disruptive, how consistently were external warning signs interpreted? Later, when Virginia Giuffre made serious allegations and Prince Andrew's name appeared in international headlines, this nighttime incident acquired an additional dimension. He fit an image of self-assurance and untouchability that was now being critically examined by many. Particularly explosive was the fact that Paul Page emphasized he had not experienced comparable difficulties with any other member of the royal family. This distinction lent his statements additional weight. It wasn't a general critique of the institution, but rather specific experiences with a particular individual. As public debate about the responsibility and exemplary role of royals intensified, the question gained in sharpness. How much special status can a modern monarchy tolerate, and at what point does privilege tip over into problematic overconfidence? The nighttime alarm was more than just an episode. It was a moment in which 2 worlds collided. The world of strict security protocols and the world of a prince who apparently wanted to disregard restrictions. For Paul Page, this was the beginning of a series of observations that later coalesced into a considerably darker overall picture. Was it merely a misunderstanding in an exceptional situation, or did it reveal the underlying pattern of behavior that would make global headlines years later? And should the warning signs have been taken more seriously earlier? With these questions hanging in the air, the discussion about personal responsibility and power in the shadow of the crown intensified. What sounds like a trivial footnote developed into one of the most disturbing revelations surrounding Prince Andrew. It wasn't about diplomatic trips, military achievements, or international contacts. It was about stuffed animals. Dozens of them. Paul Page reported that Prince Andrew owned a collection of about 50 to 60 teddy bears. Other reports even spoke of 72. But the real shock lay not in the number, but in the staging. On the Duke of York's bed, the teddy bears had to be placed in a precisely prescribed arrangement, and this arrangement was documented on a laminated card kept in a drawer. This card showed the exact layout of the stuffed animals. Every position was fixed, every distance implicitly predetermined. To outsiders, this might seem like an eccentric quirk. But according to Paul Page, it was far more than that. The arrangement had to be exactly restored after every cleaning of the room. If a teddy bear was positioned incorrectly, it led to strong reactions. Later, Charlotte Brick, a former palace employee, confirmed this account. She described the effort involved in arranging the teddy bears according to a precise scheme. Mistakes were not tolerated. Jeanette McGwen also recounted experiences that reinforced the image of a controlling and demanding master of the house. The question that arose was not about an unusual predilection. Rather, it concerned the power imbalance between a high-ranking royal and the employees who served him. When adult staff members are pressured because a stuffed animal is not positioned exactly, it reveals more than just a whim. Points to an attitude. This episode was one of several others. Charlotte Bricks recalled a situation in which she was sent up several flights of stairs to close curtains, even though Prince William was nearby. Here too, the focus was not on the act itself, but on the demonstrative exercise of authority. Another detail concerned an incident with a dog. Charlotte Bricks reported that she had been bitten by a Norfolk Terrier. Instead of reacting with concern, Prince Andrew, according to her account, did not take it seriously. Such accounts reinforced the image of a distance between rank and respect. For observers, this teddy bear affair took on symbolic significance. It represented control, the need for absolute order, but also the willingness to blame others for the slightest deviations. Especially in the context of later revelations about contacts with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, each detail seemed like a piece of a larger mosaic. While Queen Elizabeth stood for discipline and restraint, and Prince Philip was seen as the defining figure of the family patriarch, the discrepancy between expectations and reports about Prince Andrew grew. Prince Charles and later King Charles II also faced the repercussions when the reputation of the institution as a whole was called into question. The public reacted particularly sensitively to these details because they were tangible. An international trade mandate is abstract. A military operation is decades in the past. But a bed full of precisely arranged teddy bears, that's an image that sticks in the mind. At the same time, a fundamental question arose. Are such accounts an expression of individual eccentricity or a symptom of a deeper problem in the handling of power? And how many employees might have told similar stories if public pressure hadn't increased? The teddy bear affair may seem trivial on the surface, but it revealed a climate in which hierarchies were sharply defined. For Paul Page and other former employees, it was another piece in a larger picture that was later dramatically intensified by Virginia Giuffre's allegations regarding the connections to Jeffrey Epstein and the role of Ghislaine Maxwell. What remains is the question of whether these clues had existed for a long time, hidden behind courtly rituals and discreet loyalty, and whether Prince Andrew's story would have unfolded differently if internal warning signs had come to light earlier. How often can an outsider cross the threshold of one of the world's most heavily secured buildings before questions inevitably arise? This very question came into focus when Paul Page spoke about Ghislaine Maxwell's conspicuous presence at Buckingham Palace. Page reported that he first noticed Ghislaine Maxwell in 2001, the same year that Virginia Giuffre later made serious allegations against Prince Andrew. While these allegations only spread globally years later, a different drama was apparently unfolding inside the palace. According to accounts, Ghislaine Maxwell enjoyed a remarkable degree of access. Particularly concerning was the frequency of her visits. A colleague of Page's recalled that in one day, Ghislaine Maxwell entered and left the palace 4 times. This repeated coming and going was unusual even for experienced security personnel. For the team, this wasn't just a casual visit from an acquaintance, but a pattern. In the context of Jeffrey Epstein's later revelations and Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction, this description, in retrospect, seemed like a warning sign. While young women were, according to later investigations, entangled in problematic networks, Ghislaine Maxwell apparently moved freely in the circle of a high-ranking member of the royal family. Added to this were statements from Ghislaine Maxwell's inner circle. Jen Raleigh, who knew her from her university days, described in a documentary a close connection between her and Prince Andrew. Ian Maxwell also confirmed his sister's friendship with the Duke of York. These indications reinforced the image of a relationship that went beyond superficial acquaintance. At the same time, Prince Andrew had emphasized in later public statements that his contacts with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell had been limited. This discrepancy between portrayal and observation became the focus of the debate. If Ghislaine Maxwell did indeed have access to Buckingham Palace several times a day, the question of the depth of this connection inevitably arose. For security personnel, Ghislaine Maxwell's social standing was less important than the fact that security protocols provided clear structures. Anyone who regularly came and went attracted attention. The repeated visits generated internal interest, even if they had no immediate external consequences. As the Jeffrey Epstein affair escalated internationally, perceptions changed radically. Suddenly, previous encounters were re-evaluated. The close relationship between Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell became the focus of a global discussion about responsibility and moral integrity. Virginia Gifford's civil lawsuit added further pressure. The timing was particularly damaging to the public image. While the allegations against Jeffrey Epstein and his network were later dealt with in court, the palace visits described above occurred precisely during the period now considered especially sensitive. For many observers, this was more than a coincidence. The institution felt compelled to create distance. The prince withdrew from official duties. After the death of Queen Elizabeth and the accession of King Charles II, the tone towards the Duke of York intensified. The debate surrounding his residence and future role symbolized an attempt to draw clear boundaries. Yet the core question remained: how could someone like Ghislaine Maxwell have so easily gained access to the inner circle? Were the warning signs simply not apparent, or were they deliberately ignored? Paul Page's reports offered no legal verdict, but they contributed to a broader picture that further undermined Prince Andrew's credibility. The more details emerged, the more difficult it became to distinguish between chance, loyalty, and deliberate ignorance. Was the close relationship merely an expression of social connections in exclusive circles? Or did the frequent visits reveal an intimacy that raised far-reaching questions about responsibility and judgment? And what lessons does a modern monarchy draw from such revelations? The answers to these questions should determine not only the fate of an individual, but also the trust in an institution that has been built on integrity for centuries. Was it merely an extravagant lifestyle, or was a systematic pattern emerging? This question brought Paul Page's statements about Prince Andrew's daily female visitors into sharp focus. According to Page, there was a constant stream of female guests who regularly visited Prince Andrew's residence. For the security team, this coming and going had become so routine that it hardly raised any eyebrows internally. But in retrospect, this very pattern took on a new significance. According to Page, there was an incident in which security personnel initially refused entry to a female visitor, as they had to follow standard protocols. Prince Andrew's reaction was vehement. For the officers involved, this was not a mere misunderstanding, but rather an expression of his displeasure at the enforcement of regular security standards. Combined with earlier reports, such as the nighttime incident in Queen Elizabeth II private quarters, or accounts of the treatment of staff, a complete picture emerged. It was less about isolated incidents and more about recurring dynamics. A member of the royal family with extensive privileges encountered staff whose job it was to enforce the rules. The question of these visitors' identities remained unanswered. But in the context of the later revelations surrounding Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, every hint took on new significance. Virginia Gifford had publicly made serious allegations, leading to a civil lawsuit and ultimately an out-of-court settlement. The Princess Grace denied the accusations, but the damage to the royal image was already enormous. Paul Page emphasized that the security team had been in a difficult position. On the one hand, there was the obligation to adhere to protocol. On the other hand, Prince Andrew was not just any resident of the palace, but the Duke of York, son of Queen Elizabeth II, and Prince Philip, brother of Prince Charles. In such an environment, any confrontation could become delicate. Additional accounts from former employees reinforced the picture of a problematic handling of authority. Charlotte Brix and Jeanette McGowan had already described incidents that, in their view, indicated disrespectful behavior towards staff. Even a former foot soldier described an atmosphere in which morning encounters were not always characterized by courtesy. Over time, it became clear that these were not isolated incidents. Several voices painted a similar picture. Observers got the impression that a different self-image lay hidden behind the facade of the decorated war veteran. The Jeffrey Epstein affair ultimately acted as a catalyst. What might previously have been dismissed as gossip or internal discontent was suddenly viewed in a new light. The regular visits, the intensive contacts, the reactions to security measures. Everything became part of a larger debate about responsibility and moral integrity. When Prinswich withdrew from public duties, it was a historic turning point. The monarchy reacted by distancing itself. At the latest, with the accession of King Charles II, it became clear that a return to official functions seemed hardly realistic. Discussions about residence, financial support, and status issues made it clear that the crisis had far-reaching consequences. But the central question remained. Was this behavior an expression of personal weakness or a symptom of a system that had uncritically accepted privileges for too long? When security forces hesitate to enforce clear rules because rank and title are at stake, it reveals structural tensions. For many observers, this chapter of the story marked the moment when trust was fundamentally shaken, not just because of isolated allegations, but because of the impression of a pattern. Had the public been too willing to ignore warning signs for too long? And what mechanisms does an institution need to ensure that power doesn't become taken for granted? With these questions, the story approached its dramatic climax, a point at which the carefully constructed image threatened to finally shatter under the weight of the revelations. In the end, what remained was not just a damaged image, but a complete collapse of a narrative cultivated for decades. What began as isolated allegations developed into one of the deepest crises in the recent history of the British monarchy, and at its center was Prince Andrew. The statements by Paul Page, Charlotte Brix, and Jeanette McGowan added to a picture already heavily tarnished by international reporting on Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Added to this was the civil lawsuit filed by Virginia Duffer, which forced Prince Andrew into a legal battle. Even though an out-of-court settlement was eventually reached, the reputational damage remained. The turning point was undoubtedly the BBC Newside interview in November 2019, which, intended as an attempt to clarify the situation, became a PR disaster for many observers. Prince Andrew's explanations were unconvincing. The public reaction was overwhelmingly critical. Within a few days, he withdrew from his official duties. But the crisis did not end there. After the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022 and the accession of King Charles II, the internal power dynamics shifted. King Charles II signaled clear signs of distance. Discussions about the Royal Lodge residence in Wintergrade Park became public. The impression arose that the Duke of York would no longer have a place in the active core of the monarchy in the long term. For many observers, this was more than a personal tragedy. It symbolized that even a son of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip is not immune to consequences. The institution reacted with visible restraint. Public appearances were reduced. Titles lost their practical significance, and representative duties were suspended. At the same time, the credibility of the entire monarchy came under scrutiny. If internal warning signs, such as those described by Paul Page, had been ignored for so long, the question of control mechanisms arose. Should earlier indications have been taken more seriously, loyalty and discretion were prioritized over transparency. The role of Prince Charles, now King Charles II, was also reassessed. As the long-time heir to the throne, he had witnessed these developments firsthand. Many associated his accession with the hope of a modernized, more responsible monarchy. The handling of Prince Andrew became a litmus test for this expectation. History shows how quickly a public narrative can shift. For decades, Prince Andrew was considered the battle-hardened royal, a dedicated and responsible member of the royal family, and the father of Princess Beatrice and Princess Ine. But the combination of legal allegations, problematic contacts, and internal reports painted a different picture. Paul Page's revelations were not a legal verdict. They were personal accounts, but they resonated within an already sensitive environment. At a time when transparency and accountability are demanded more than ever, such reports act as accelerants. Today, Prince Andrew has largely disappeared from public view. The discussion about his future has subsided, but the questions remain. Can an institution like the British monarchy maintain lasting stability? When individual members generate serious headlines, withdrawal from public life is often enough to respond to moral and societal criticism. The case also demonstrates how closely intertwined personal conduct and institutional credibility are. When power, privilege, and a lack of self-reflection converge, tensions arise that can destabilize even centuries-old structures. The final outcome is sobering. Prince Andrew's carefully constructed image has been shattered. Paul Page's statements, Virginia Giuffre's allegations, the connections to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and the disastrous BBC News interview have severely damaged public trust. But perhaps the most important question is not directed at just one person, but at society as a whole. How should abuse of power be dealt with when it lies at the heart of a time-honored institution? And what reforms are necessary to prevent future crises? Princess Grace's story is not just a personal scandal. It reflects the challenges facing modern monarchies. Whether lasting change will result remains to be seen. The story of Princess Grace's dramatic transformation from celebrated war veteran to isolated royal in the shadow of a global scandal unfolds. Beginning with internal reports from Paul Page about problematic behavior at Buckingham Palace, through bizarre episodes such as the meticulous arrangement of teddy bears, to close contacts with Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, a picture emerged that increasingly clashed with her public image. The allegations by Virginia Giuffre, the controversial BBC News interview, and the subsequent withdrawal from public duties marked decisive turning points. With the accession of King Charles II, it became clear that a return to representative functions was hardly conceivable. The debate surrounding the residence, status, and role of the Duke of York symbolized this profound rupture. What remains is an institution that must reposition itself. The case of Prince Andrew raises fundamental questions about transparency, accountability, and internal control mechanisms. How much privilege is still acceptable in a modern monarchy? And how can trust and credibility be secured in the long term? The story does not end with a verdict, but with open questions. Questions that extend far beyond a single individual and could significantly shape the future of the monarchy.